9. Submarine K-19. Built during the late 1950s as one of the Soviet Union's first generation of nuclear submarines, K-19 was the rushed response to America's latest developments in nuclear sub-technology. It proved to be less than reliable, often encountering mechanical problems and getting into accidents. K-19 almost sank numerous times, and more than 24 crew members died throughout its several catastrophes. But it wasn't decommissioned until 1990, and in 2002 it was towed to a shipyard with plans to be scrapped. Russian Navy veteran Vladimir Romanov, who once served on K-19, couldn't bear to see it dismantled and forgotten, so he bought part of the submarine and transported the cabin to the banks of the Pavlovsky Reservoir. Romanov hoped to use the cabin as a meeting place for submarine veterans from Russia and other countries. The idea was controversial from the get-go, especially considering K-19's tragic history, and Romanov's plans have received little support since then. For now, the salvage wheelhouse functions mostly as a monument, and the plans to turn it into a clubhouse seem to be on hold. 8. Hovercraft train. During the 1960s, Britain attempted to develop a hovercraft train which would ride along a track atop a cushion of air created by strong fans. Its designers claimed it would be able to function in all types of weather, with a maximum speed of 300 miles per hour. Dubbed the RTV-31, it would transport passengers from London to Glasgow in 2 hours, 3 times faster than any existing train at the time. But that was only if everything went according to plan. Unfortunately, the hover pads were heavy and didn't function as effectively as engineers had hoped. The engine was huge and inconvenient to repair, and building the track would prove costly. There was also speculation from the inventor of the train's linear induction motor, Eric Laithwaite, that the RTV-31 would be unsafe. Eric proclaimed that there was a possibility for the vehicle to drive itself off the track. During its first test run, the train reached a disappointing maximum speed of just 12 miles per hour. The project rapidly lost support after that and was eventually cancelled in 1973. Today, the only surviving relic of the hover train is a single aging car that sits atop a portion of track in Peterborough, serving as a constant reminder of a failed endeavour that was once praised as the UK's up-and-coming new form of travel. 7. Spirit of Rochester. From 1986 to 2004, the Spirit of Rochester offered lunch and dinner cruises along the Genesee River in upstate New York. Today, it sits abandoned and continues to decay with an uncertain future. Named for the city it was based out of, the 156-foot boat had enough room for more than 500 passengers. Local businessman Donald Sir bought the vessel after the Rochester's 150th anniversary attracted thousands of visitors to the area in 1984. He figured the renewed interest in the local beach and harbour had created a viable market for cruises in nearby Lake Ontario. The boat underwent extensive restoration after its journey to Rochester from its previous home in Connecticut. When it opened to the public, passengers were given the options of a 2-hour lunch or a 3-hour dinner cruise. Business got off to a somewhat slow start, but eventually it picked up and became a hit among both locals and tourists. Sir paid off the debts from his startup costs within 2 years, and sales remained high until the Spirit of Rochester struck a sunken tugboat in 2004, which created a hole in the vessel's hull. The boat was towed to Rochester for repairs, but it failed to open for the 2006 season as planned. It was eventually sold to new owners, who began renovations but stopped at some point and left the boat behind. Since 2017, it's remained docked along the Genesee River with no clear plan for the future. In 2022, a viewer wrote to local station News 10 NBC, asking if the boat will at least be scrapped or taken out of the water. News correspondent Emily Putnam was unable to reach its current owner, but a State Department of Environmental Conservation spokesperson said that it would only fall under the agency's jurisdiction under certain circumstances, including if it poses a navigational hazard, starts leaking fuel, or otherwise becomes dangerous. 6. Drug smuggling subs. While patrolling in the Atlantic Ocean roughly 100 miles off Costa Rica one day in 2006, the crew of a US Coast Guard cutter spotted something strange in the water that they didn't immediately recognize. When they sailed closer, they saw what appeared to be 3 snorkels poking through the water's surface. Apparently, what they'd found was a homemade submarine. Inside were 4 men, as well as an AK-47 and a 3-ton shipment of cocaine. The Coast Guard seized the 49-foot vessel, which was nicknamed Bigfoot, and parked it in the water outside the Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, Florida. In 2009, Rear Admiral Joseph Nimitz told the New York Times that the Coast Guard heard rumors of the semi-submersible's existence long before its capture. According to Nimitz, it is just one of 3 that were captured that year. Bigfoot was built by hand in Colombia. It was an example of how the drug trade evolves along with law enforcement's ability to catch traffickers, and is just one of many narco submarines that have been captured since then. Over time, the name Bigfoot came to be a general term applied to many different smuggling subs for their somewhat mythical status, for being talked about but hardly ever seen. As David Kushner of the New York Times pointed out, building a submarine is a noticeable activity, and it's extremely difficult to carry out in secrecy. But cartels have resources, and the mangroves along Colombia's Pacific coast provide enough coverage to get the job done. And while traveling in a homemade submarine comes with obvious dangers, it pays well, especially since these vessels can carry much bigger shipments of drugs than boats that travel on the surface. Spotting these vessels can be tricky for authorities, not only because they travel mostly underwater, but because they're often painted dark blue or they're camouflaged to blend in with the sea. It's reportedly believed that dozens of narco submarines reach US shores undetected every year. For now, the so-called war on drugs continues, while abandoned and captured Bigfoot submarines increasingly appear along beaches and waterways. What do you think is the best means of transportation in the modern world? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. 5. Elvis Presley's jet. The king of rock and roll cut no corners when it came to enjoying his fortune. He owned 3 private planes that he used for both business and pleasure. Graceland sold the first 2, then bought them back and parked them on the property, where they remain on display today. Elvis bought the 3rd aircraft, a 1962 Lockheed Jetstar, as a Christmas gift to himself in 1976, just 8 months before his death. He paid $840,000 for it, which would be around $4.4 million today. The Elvis Presley estate sold the Jetstar shortly after his death. It was parked at Roswell International Air Center in New Mexico, and more or less forgotten about until relatively recently, when plans to auction it off were announced. Based on the dilapidated condition of the plane's exterior, it's clear it's been neglected for years. The engines and many of the cockpit components have been stripped, and the paint is visibly faded. The interior contains swiveling or red velvet seating for 6 passengers, gold and suede trimmings, and a red carpet. There's also a bathroom with a vanity, a VCR, and cassette players, which would have been high-tech features at the time. By all appearances, it was most likely customized to Elvis's liking, but it's unclear how much he used the jet in the short time he owned it. In early 2023, the jet was sold for $260,000 on what would have been the singer's 88th birthday. 4. Soviet walking excavator. Most people are unaware of the existence of a bizarre vehicle called the walking excavator. Also known as a spider excavator, these construction machines have leg or arm-like extensions, sometimes with wheels which move in increments, hence the term walking. The walking excavator was invented for use on steep inclines, uneven terrain, and other positions that are inaccessible to conventional excavators. Its design and movement also spreads the weight of exceptionally heavy loads that would otherwise cause the machine to sink into the ground. The Soviet Union developed some of the largest ever walking excavators. Their designs proved to be both durable and reliable, and the machines are still built and used in Russia and around the world today. But it seems as though manufacturers have scaled back somewhat on the size of these vehicles, perhaps because the largest ones simply weren't needed by many people. In recent years, footage of someone operating a rusting walking excavator went viral on social media. At first glance, the vehicle looks so old that it's hard to believe it could still run, but as it slowly starts to move, it becomes clear that the machine is still functional. It was reportedly built around 1979 and appears to be sitting in a large open field somewhere in the former Soviet Union. Unfortunately, some of the exact details of the machine are conflicting between sources, and any other information on the vehicle has proven difficult to find. 3. Ilyushin Il-76. In 2011, a pair of earthquakes devastated eastern Turkey, killing over 600 people and destroying thousands of buildings. Among those who delivered aid was a Soviet-built Ilyushin Il-76 that was dispatched by the now-defunct Sky Georgia airline. Built in 1984, the 153-foot-long 4-engine strategic airlifter was used primarily for cargo. After dropping off a shipment of humanitarian supplies at Erzurum Airport, the plane clipped the wing of another Il-76 while being towed back to the runway. It was then rendered unairworthy and was parked outside the airport with plans to repair it and resume operations as usual. But there were issues with the insurance company, so that never ended up happening. The aircraft subsequently spent the next 11 years languishing in place, while the Georgian government took no apparent efforts to retrieve it. But in 2022, the Turkish government announced plans to auction off the nearly 40-year-old Il-76 at auction, with bids starting at just 400,000 Turkish lira, or around $21,500. While the plane's condition certainly didn't improve while it sat there neglected for over a decade, it was in better condition than many abandoned aircraft, because the cockpit was kept covered. Unfortunately though, it's not entirely clear whether a buyer was found or how much they paid for the plane. 2. U-475 Black Widow. Foxtrot B-39, also known by its current name U-475 Black Widow, was a Soviet Navy submarine of the Foxtrot class. During the first part of its career in the late 1960s, the 302-foot-long ship served in the Baltic Fleet and was based at Latvia's capital Riga. Later on, the submarine was used for training crews from overseas who would be navigating Foxtrot submarines for their country's navies. U-475 remained in service for 27 years until it was decommissioned in 1994. It was then sold to a private buyer who gave the sub its current name. It was later moored in London near the Thames Barrier, where it operated as a floating maritime museum. A few years later, in 1998, the submarine was moved to the waters off the port town of Folkestone, where it remained open to the public. But in 2004, it was moved for a final time to the River Medway near Rochester, England, where it's been sitting in a state of disrepair ever since. There are reportedly plans to restore the Black Widow, but it's unclear when the work is slated to begin. For now, it continues to languish in the river, where it flies the Ukrainian flag to show where its owner's support lies in the current conflict. 1. Roadside Locomotive. Along a quiet highway in rural Indiana, there's a dilapidated old Amtrak locomotive that clearly hasn't moved in years. It's covered in rust and chipped paint, and several of the windows, doors, and headlights are missing. According to a post on Facebook's Abandoned and Forgotten Indiana page, the locomotive sits along Highway 54 outside the small town of Duggar, which is home to just 900 residents. Unfortunately, the post didn't include any other information about the train. In a bid to learn more about it, a writer for local radio station 103 GBF did some digging online and concluded that the locomotive is most likely a turboliner RTG. Built during the early 1970s, Amtrak's first batch of RTGs operated along routes throughout the American Midwest. While it's unclear how long the roadside train has sat abandoned at its current site, it may have entered service as many as 50 years ago, and it looks like it could have been left to decay not too long after that. 5. MV Asalama. A tiny passenger ferry called the MV Asalama was leaving the port of Tarfanja and heading to the Canary Islands in 2008. While going through the Flag of Panama, she crashed into the rocks. Even after all these years, the wreck is still clearly visible. In 1967, the ferry was built at the Oi Wärtsilä A/B shipyard in Turku, Finland. It measured a length of 331 feet. 2 diesel engines powered the drive, which produced a speed capable of 90 knots while powering 2 propellers. The Silja Line originally owned the ferry from 1967 until 1970. The ship's first name was the MV Botnia. It was operated by the Ang Fargis Akti Bolaget Bor H. Whelan lines from 1970 to 1975. The Spanish airline company Compa Transmediterránea acquired the ferry in 1975, and they used it until 1999 under the name MV Cuidad de la Laguna. The little ferry was then bought by Navier Armas, who gave it a new name, MV Volcan de Tenagua. The vessel started running between the Moroccan port of Tafalla and the Canary island of Fuerteventura in 2008 under yet another new name, MV Asalama. On April 30th, 2008, while on one of its journeys, the ship struck a dock, causing severe hull damage. The ship's crew made the decision to run aground close to the coast since the leaks were so significant. The next rescue effort ended in the recovery of all 113 onboard passengers, as well as 30 crew members. The ferry was eventually just abandoned on the rocks due to the ship's poor condition, corrosion, and age. 4. Carol Deering. The true tale of the massive Carol A. Deering schooner could be the most intriguing nautical tale out of Cape Hatteras. The Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship on January 29, 1921, as she made her way back to Hampton Roads, Virginia from Barbados. The crew was wandering around when someone who did not look or act like an officer reported that the ship had lost her anchors. They passed the SS Lake Elon the next day at 5:45 p.m. southwest of the Diamond Shoals lightship. The Deering seemed to be taking a strange path. This was the schooner's tragic last report before she was discovered running aground and abandoned. On January 31, 1921, around 6:30 a.m., CP Brady of the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard Station saw a 5-masted vessel stranded and helpless on the shoals. According to reports, the ship's decks were submerged underwater, her sails were set, her lifeboats were missing, and she looked abandoned. The surf boats couldn't get to the wreck because of the rough seas that day. Finally, on February 4, 1921, the rescue arrived. It then sailed alongside the cutter Manning to the shattered ship. The Carol A. Deering was identified when Rescue Captain James Carlson stepped on board. All personal effects, important navigational tools, paperwork, and the ship's anchors were missing upon investigation. The food was arranged as if the crew was still getting ready for dinner, but strangely, there was no one in sight. The Deering's dented and shattered hull was all that remained to remember the ship's peculiar trip. The vessel was dragged away and destroyed with dynamite in March 1921 after it broke apart on the shoals. A message in a bottle that described pirate seizure of the Deering was found in April by Christopher Columbus Gray of Buxton, North Carolina. The note's author, Herbert Bates, an engineer, was confirmed by handwriting specialists, but the letter was eventually determined fake by Gray, according to analysis by federal government experts. The ship's captain's wife, Mrs. Lula Wormel, the former master, Captain Merritt, and the Reverend Dr. Addison Lorimer traveled to Washington in May 1921 and persuaded Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover to launch an open investigation. In July 1921, FBI agent Thompson paid a visit to Dare County. Among the leads he pursued were tales of mutiny, rum-running criminals, and pirates. He questioned local shoreline guardsmen about the idea that the crew had simply mutinied and left the ship, and they said impossible, since the coast was way too choppy for safe lifeboat landings. Captain Balance of the Cape Hatteras station stated, "I believe they abandoned her after taking everything of value." He also claimed the crew ran her up the shoals on purpose. The investigation was ultimately unsuccessful. No evidence of the crew, the ship's log, or the navigational aids were ever found. It's still a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. What do you think happened to the Deering? Let us know in the comments down below, and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video so far. 3. The Royal Merchant. The Royal Commercial, which is often referred to as the Merchant Royal, was an English merchant ship that met a tragic end in 1641 off the coast of Cornwall, England. When England and Spain were at peace, the Royal Merchant spent 2 years in the waters of the West Indies between 1637 and 1640 dealing with Spanish territories. After finishing her business, the boat returned to London with her sister ship, the Dover Merchant. They stopped at Cadiz on their route home so they could fix a leak in the Royal Merchant. While it was docked in Cadiz, the captain and crew witnessed a Spanish ship catch on fire. The ship was on its way to Flanders to pay for 30,000 Habsburg soldiers in treasure. After the loss of the Spanish ship, Captain Limbri of the Royal Merchant saw a lucrative opportunity and offered to transport the Spanish's loot to Antwerp on their way back to England to earn a small profit. A staggering amount of gold and silver were now waiting inside the Royal Merchant's cargo. It's estimated that it contained at least 100,000 pounds of gold, 400 bars of Mexican silver, and nearly 500,000 pieces of 8 and other currencies, valuing an astounding sum of over $1.5 billion. The Royal Merchant's chances of making it home were low, thanks to the lengthy journey and the increased shipload from the added valuables. The Royal Merchant perished in a watery grave on September 23, 1641, after a storm opened up leaks and malfunctioning pumps were unable to get rid of the oncoming water. 18 men died in the sinking, along with a rumored amount of treasure, while Captain Limbury and 40 of his crew escaped. To continue their journey home, Limbury and the survivors were picked up by their sister ship, Dover Merchant. Over the centuries, a few treasure hunters have searched for the missing Royal Merchant ship. For many years, the Odyssey marine exploration business sought after the treasure, and in 2007, they found a wreckage where they discovered approximately $500 million worth of silver and gold. The Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, a Spanish ship that sank in 1804 off the southern coast of Portugal, was thought to have carried some of the riches that were lost when it first sank, although many people still believe this came from the Royal Merchant. A long shank anchor with an Admiralty pattern, similar to the one the Royal Merchant would have used, got entangled in fishing nets in March 2019. Cornish fishermen aboard the Spirited Lady dredged up the anchor from the seafloor, about 20 miles from Land's End and about 300 feet below sea level. The Royal Merchant, a ship carrying $1.5 billion in treasure, was lost to the stormy waters off the coast of Cornwall in 1641. The Odyssey Marine Exploration Firm and several others are still searching for the ship and money today. 2. The Witchcraft. On the night of December 22, 1967, seasoned sailor and hotelier Dan Burak sailed off on the Witchcraft luxury cabin cruiser with his friend, Father Patrick Horgan, to see holiday lights off the coast of Miami, Florida. Unfortunately, not too far offshore at 9 p.m., the boat collided with something beneath the water. Although he did not perceive any imminent danger, Dan seemed like he knew the yacht's rudder or even the propeller system had been damaged in the collision. The actual hull, though, appeared fine. Dan called the Miami Coast Guard at 9 p.m. and let them know he needed help getting back to the marina he left from. Additionally, he said that there was no emergency on the Witchcraft. He was calm and collected when making the call, according to those who received it. Despite sending help as soon as they could, they didn't think there was an urgent problem based on the tone of Dan's voice. They didn't notice anything unusual about the situation until they arrived, barely 19 minutes after Dan's call had been answered. Many locals were aware that the Witchcraft had a custom floating system. The opulent boat was thought to be unsinkable, but history often proves otherwise. When help came, the Witchcraft had vanished into thin air. In actuality, there was no indication that the yacht had been in a struggle, and there was no sign a boat had ever been there at all. At this moment, Witchcraft started to gain traction as the newest Bermuda Triangle mystery. The boat somehow vanished, and the Miami Coast Guard was at a loss for words. They never got any other requests for help from the vessel. To keep an eye out for the cruiser, they issued a warning to all ships. Dan, the priest, and his cherished Witchcraft were still not found after a thorough search covering a region of 1,200 square miles. Despite the fact the boats were actively keeping an eye out for the boat, nobody saw it anywhere. Over the course of 6 days, an astonishing 24,500 square miles was eventually searched. The next Bermuda Triangle mystery seemed to be the Witchcraft incident. They're believed to be missing, but not at sea, according to the Miami Coast Guard. The Witchcraft mystery, which is one of the biggest unsolved nautical cases, will likely never be solved. 1. SS Poet. The SS Poet was built in 1944 for the US Navy. She was first used to transport troops during World War II up until 1949, when she was then sold a few times before eventually sitting unused for nearly 20 years. The Hawaiian Eugenia Corp bought the ship in 1979 and revived it as a bulk cargo carrier. The Poets left Girard Point in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on October 24, 1980, with a crew of 34 and 13,500 tons of corn. The ship was heavy on the bow and responded slowly as it made its way into Port Said, Egypt. These problems were of little consequence, as the ship was given the all-clear to start cruising along the Delaware River towards the Atlantic. When it passed by Cape Henlopen, Delaware around 8:30 a.m., it reported its location. This was the poet's last known communication ever. Although the ship was obligated to notify the Marine Administration of her location every 2 days, she didn't follow orders, and she wasn't reported missing until November 3rd, 1980. By then, if the ship had continued on its path, she would have arrived in Egypt at some point or another, but because of the delay, the search was difficult. In either case, the US Coast Guard launched a major investigation and search effort that spanned 290,000 square miles from Cape Henlopen to the Straits of Gibraltar. Additionally, a total of 9 aircraft searched about 393,000 square miles. The ship, its 34-person crew, any debris or an oil leak were never found. Another investigation was launched by the Marine Board in an effort to find out what happened to the poet, but other things soon came to light. At the Baltimore, Maryland Radio Control Tower, a brief alarm was heard on October 26, 1980. Because it was so short, it was impossible to tell if it was from the poet. But if it was, the ship's location suggested it was around the edge of the Sargasso Sea, in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. Before leaving Philadelphia, the ship underwent an inspection from the Coast Guard. Despite certain flaws found, they weren't deemed unsafe enough to stop the ship from sailing. There were a few large oil canisters that were exposed to sparks since there was no cushioning underneath them. One of the cargo hold's hatches was broken as well, putting the hold at risk of flooding if it gave way. But since it had been that way for some time, the flaw was not seen as a serious concern. And due to the fact that the senior captain had 41 years of experience and had already taken the voyage several times, it's doubtful that the ship's lack of a navigational system presented difficulties. Last but not least, the ship was slightly listed before it sailed. But this imbalance was easily fixed by rearranging fuel barrels. There was a horrific storm that had intense winds up to nearly 60 knots and high seas that reached 30 feet in the North Atlantic on October 25, 1980. It's believed that maybe the poet surrendered to this storm, despite having gone through much worse in the past. The Coast Guard's final maritime report said that the poet was most likely lost between October 25th and 26th, when it was subjected to the harsh weather.
Number 6. German Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter jets. Pictures of several German Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter jets lined up somewhere in Germany back in 1945 have circulated around the internet, but their fates were unknown for the longest time. The Me-262 was a groundbreaking aircraft that ushered in the jet age era. It was the first of its kind powered by a turbojet engine, and its performance and firepower made it an essential part of the air forces around the world, but it was not without flaws. Its power plants were incredibly unreliable, and its endurance was short-lived. Its combat tactics remained primitive compared to the new American bombers, and it had trouble staying on course for long periods of time. Me-262s only flew a couple of missions against Allied bombers and fighters. They were mainly used as interceptor roles to attack enemy fighters from the sky or to engage them on the ground before they could shoot down an Allied plane. The jet's high speed, low altitude, and small wings made it difficult for turret gunners to see the aircraft. They also found it hard to latch onto targets from a distance and had trouble tracking the jets once they were in range. They were also vulnerable to Allied bombing and strafing, since they often had to fly in tight box formations with several other fighters at once. This means that if an Allied fighter pilot was in the wrong position, they were probably going to be shot down by an Me-262. But it wasn't just a matter of luck. The Me-262, created after years of development with many versions undergoing testing before it was finally adopted for operational service in June of 1943. Despite its limitations, the Me-262 set records for some of the highest levels of accuracy and firepower in the world. Its 4 full-auto 30mm cannons fired 500 rounds at 300 RPM each and could be mounted on pylons to add extra cannon pods, bombs, or rockets. But these were very heavy and needed to be carefully handled by the pilot. Some of the more experienced airmen were able to use the aircraft to the best of its ability, but it was still no match for an Allied bomber or fighter. In addition, the 30mm cannons had a very low muzzle velocity, and they weren't as accurate at higher ranges. The cannons were not capable of delivering enough energy to destroy an Allied bomber when it was in a vulnerable position, which is why they were mainly used against low-flying fighters that were not in a high-altitude position. After the war, the USAAF used Me-262s that they'd captured to study and test their combat effectiveness. This research influenced the development of the American fighters that soon became icons of the jet age, including the North American F-86 Sabre and the Boeing B-47 Stratojet. Some of these jets have survived and are now on display in museums, while others were built into flying replicas. These make up some of the most interesting and unique aircraft that have come to light since the aftermath of World War II. 5. Ghost Fleet of Mallows Bay. In the eerie waters of Mallows Bay, there's weathered wood and rusted iron sticking out of the water like the ribs of a ship. It's part of an 18 square mile section that's home to a ghost fleet of shipwrecks that go back 3 centuries. Mallows Bay is a treasure trove of America's past. Found on the Potomac River in Maryland, the site is steeped in history and wildlife. It's home to a thriving community, as well as a rich natural resources. The bay has been reclaimed by nature, with plants sprouting from the ground and animals returning to the once deserted area. In addition to the reclaiming of these sites, a new National Marine Sanctuary has been designated there by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration back in July 2019. NOAA, the state of Maryland, and Charles County will manage the Mallows Bay Potomac River National Marine Sanctuary together. On a sunny day, you can take your kayak into Mallows Bay and see the dozens of sunken steamships that once traveled through the waters of the Potomac River. The shipwrecks are a testament to the unique era in U.S. history. When World War II first started, the United States quickly launched a shipbuilding program to meet its growing needs for a merchant fleet. This effort led to a significant era in U.S. maritime history and offered valuable lessons that helped the country prepare for another war. Today, the remnants of these ships rest peacefully in the shallow waters of Mallows Bay as reminders of the old days. 4. Old Car City. When you visit Old Car City, USA in White, Georgia, you'll see some of the world's oldest cars that have been reclaimed by nature. These rusted beauties are buried by greenery, and even though the rust has taken over, they're still very photogenic. Old Car City is known as a photographer's paradise and has people from around the world coming for a visit. Dean Lewis, owner of Old Car City, USA, says that he feels a sense of morality in saving these relics. He stops them from being scrapped or hidden away. He's a car collector who acquired the business back in 1970. There's something magical about this auto graveyard that attracts visitors. The 32-acre property has been in Lewis family ownership since 1931 and started out as a general store selling used vehicle parts before it became a museum for reclaiming junk cars. In the early 2000s, he started charging for admission to the museum and has since grown it into a fully self-supporting operation. While he still sells some auto parts, Old Car City, USA is now a museum where you can walk around and see the beauty of nature. There are over 4,000 cars in the junkyard, and most of them are at least 40 years old. These relics are surprisingly varied. There are cars that used to be famous, such as the last vehicle purchased by Elvis Presley before his death in 1977, and others that aren't nearly that valuable at all. In addition to the rusted cars, you can also see some amazing art created by nature. Other vehicles seen here include big fin Cadillacs and a rare 1941 Mack milk truck. They're decked out with flowers, branches, and other natural elements, making them look like they've been plucked right off the road and wrapped in a warm forest canopy. Another piece of art that nature has produced is a shabby 1980s Oldsmobile with a Planet logo featured on the front. It seems that the rusty body has morphed as it's encased in trees and twigs. Instead of letting the cars rust in a junkyard, Lewis allows nature to do its thing amongst the metal, creating one of the most unique attractions in the country. They're a beautiful sight to see, and it's no wonder media outlets and photographers have been flocking to the area for years. Another highlight of the place is that most of the cars are parked inside the forest itself, which helps create an immersive experience for visitors. Some of these trees are so tall that they're grown right through a car. You can really see Mother Nature at work here, reclaiming the vehicles in an incredible way. While many of the cars at Old Car City are rusted beyond repair, they have remained a popular destination for photographers. The cars' run-down appearances can quickly turn into awe-inspiring works of art, depending on the light and time of day, which keeps the location busy. Lewis also has a loft where visitors can appreciate and buy his pen and ink art pieces on styrofoam cups. They can even purchase a limited edition poster of one of the cars he's gotten most creative with, featuring his doodles on a unique canvas. Would you ever take the time to restore an older car? Let us know what you think it'd be worth in the comments. And if you're enjoying the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more. 3. The USS Sachem. For the past 25 years, a 175-foot ship has been rusting away on a small Petersburg, Kentucky creek. The ship is virtually hidden from view by trees, large reeds, and an accumulation of driftwood. She's only fully accessible after hiking across a field and paddling out onto the creek to see her up close and personal. The USS Sachem, or the Celt, was built back in 1902 by Pusey and Jones in Wilmington, Delaware, for a railroad executive named J. Rogers Maxwell. It was officially launched in April 1902. After sailing around the world, the ship was repurposed by the U.S. Navy for wartime service and used to defend America against German submarines in World War I. She was equipped with depth charges and even machine guns. It was a speedy, nimble vessel that the Navy rented to help patrol the East Coast and fight against U-boats. Then, in 1917, it was loaned to Thomas Edison as a research boat for government-funded experiments on defending against submarines. Thomas Edison was a prolific inventor and businessman who made many significant contributions to the world, including the invention of the light bulb. His ideas were a major force behind the modernization of electricity, which moves our current society. When the United States entered World War I, the Navy requisitioned private boats and yachts like Sachem to help defend from U-boats wreaking havoc on British and American shipping lines. With new armaments and sonar capabilities, the USS Sachem became an invaluable tool against the German forces. She was sold to a Philadelphia banker after the war. Then, in 1986, she was purchased by a Cincinnati boat enthusiast who decided to restore it. He took it through the Erie Canal, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, and the Ohio River. He sailed it back to Boone County, Kentucky, where it now rests peacefully on Taylor Creek. The ship is a popular destination for kayakers who visit and enjoy the scenic scenery of the surrounding area on tours. The infamous ghost ship, which was once called the Celt, has been featured in several Madonna music videos, shuttled Thomas Edison around as he conducted war experiments, and even attended Ronald Reagan's relighting of the Statue of Liberty's torch. 2. The Erie Car Graveyard. In a forest near Châtillon, Belgium, there's an eerie vehicle graveyard full of rusty, vintage cars. The sight is truly awe-inspiring and has sparked many theories on why the cars were abandoned. One of the stories says that U.S. soldiers were stationed in the area during World War II, and when the war ended, they couldn't afford to ship all their cars back home. As a result, they were taken to the forest and left out there to rust. As they slowly rotted, nature took over the graveyard and started reclaiming it. The cars are now covered by leaves, moss, and other organic debris. The vintage cars are a major testament to the power of nature and how quickly it can reclaim what was once man-made. In this cemetery, there are cars dating back to the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. They are in perfect condition for a rural cemetery, with many of them being in good working order. If the cars were to be restored and worked on, they'd be worth a pretty penny. The rust is evident in the body panels, but their tires are still all intact, and most of the windows haven't been damaged at all. This car graveyard isn't the only one in the world. There are others littered throughout the countryside, all filled with a variety of cars, some that are hardly worth their price in scrap, and others that are pretty valuable. The car graveyard at Châtillon, Belgium, is definitely one of the creepiest sights in the country, and it's a testament to the power of nature. The rusted cars are now covered in leaves and other organic life, which will slowly be buried by the growth taking place in this forest. 1. Bangkok Airplane Graveyard. The ruins of abandoned cars aren't usually seen by the general public, but there are some that have been reclaimed by nature and are entering the spotlight. The Bangkok Airplane Graveyard is an absolute must if you love urban exploration and happen to be in Thailand. Located next to an auto body shop, this field is littered with a massive 747 and two smaller MD-82 planes. What is so amazing about this graveyard is that it doubles as a shelter for homeless families. It's easy to find and just a short walk away from the major BTS Prakanong station in Ramankang Road. You really need to tread carefully though when visiting this place. Broken bits and bare metal constructions could fall down at any minute. It's best to wear something sturdy, closed-toed shoes and long clothes not to get your hands dirty. Abandoned planes don't just lie forgotten. They can be converted into some amazing works of art. This gorgeous picture is just one example of this, displaying a turbine and riveted steel paneling that has just been painted. Whether you're into urban exploration or just love seeing what nature can do, these are some of the most stunning photos of abandoned airplanes you'll ever see. Hopefully, you'll be inspired to explore the world and visit some of these amazing sites. Which of these vehicles would you be interested in visiting the most? Let us know if you've heard of any others we forgot to mention. Don't forget to hit subscribe on your way out. We'll see you next time.